Monday, July 24. Reconciliation, God's gift from the cross. For he himself is our peace, who has made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility, that he might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross. And that comes from Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 to 16. How does Paul describe the cross and the impact of Christ's work there in each of these passages in Ephesians? How would you summarize what Paul says about the cross and how it transforms our relationships? And we have 5 passages to read here from the book of Ephesians. The first is Ephesians 1, verses 7 and 8. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins according to the riches of his grace, which he made to abound toward us in all wisdom and prudence. And then chapter 4, verse 32, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. And then chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, but now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made both one, and has broken down the middle wall of separation. And chapter 2, verse 16, and that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. And Ephesians 5 and verse 2, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. And the same chapter, verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. In the context of our passage for this week, Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 to 22, the cross yields 3 great assets for believers. 1. Gentiles who were far from God and his people are brought near, we read in verse 13, to both, being now sons and daughters of God and brothers and sisters of Jewish believers, we read in verse 19. 2. The hostility, the Greek word is ekthron, or enmity, related to ekthros, enemy, between Jewish and Gentile believers is itself put to death in verse 16. The cross of Christ removes what seemed to be the permanent state of hostility and war in which Jews and Gentiles were sworn enemies, we read in verse 17. 3. In the place of hostility comes reconciliation. It was Christ's purpose to reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross in verse 16, and we'll compare that with Colossians 1, 19 and 22. But before that, let's read each of those texts we've just referred to. First of all, chapter 2, verse 13, but now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. And verse 19, now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. And verse 16, and that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. And verse 17, and he came and preached peace to you who were afar off, to those who were near. And we compare this with Colossians 1, verses 19 to 22. For it pleased the Father that in him all the fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself by him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of his cross. And you, who once were alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now he has reconciled in the body of his flesh through death, to present you holy and blameless and above reproach in his sight. What does reconciliation look like? How does it feel to be reconciled? Imagine severe estrangement between a mother and daughter, one that has settled in over a period of years. Imagine this rancor being dissolved in a wave of grace and forgiveness and the ensuing reunion between the two. That is reconciliation. Reconciliation is experienced in the moment when one church member lays aside whatever issues divide from another and acknowledges the other church member as a beloved brother or sister who accepts what has been offered. Reconciliation is not a mechanical or legal term, but an interpersonal one that celebrates the mending of broken relationships. Paul dares to imagine Christ's powerful work on the cross as impacting the relationships between not just individuals, but also people groups. He imagines it invading our lives and destroying our divisions, dissolving our quarrels, and renewing our fellowship with and understanding of each other. And so to finish today, in what ways might you need to apply the principles here to be reconciled to someone else? How do you go about doing it? This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.